The airport was alive with energy, buzzing like a busy beehive. People rushed from one place to another, their footsteps blending with the hum of conversations and the occasional rumble of suitcase wheels on the smooth floor. Announcements echoed across the terminal: Flight 372 is now boarding at Gate 7. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, coming from a small cafe where travelers waited with cups in hand. The glass windows showed planes gliding across the runway, their engines roaring softly in the background. Everywhere, there was movement and purpose. Among the crowd, a woman stood out not because she was loud or flashy, but because of her calmness. Her name was Sarah. She stood by a large suitcase, gently rubbing her swollen belly. Sarah was about 7 months pregnant, and while many might have looked stressed or tired, she wore a soft, determined expression. Her brown hair was tied back neatly, and she carried a small bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't just carrying luggage, she was carrying hope, worries, and a secret strength. Sarah's journey wasn't just another vacation or business trip. It was something far more important. She was traveling to meet someone she hadn't seen in years, someone who had always been there for her during her toughest times: her sister. Her sister had been unwell recently, and Sarah felt she needed to be by her side, no matter how hard it was for her to travel in her condition. She also had a work presentation coming up, one that could change her career. Balancing family and work was never easy, but Sarah had always found a way. As Sarah prepared to board her flight, she checked her ticket and glanced at the long line of passengers. She sighed softly, feeling the weight of her responsibilities, but she didn't complain. That wasn't her style. Sarah was the kind of person who faced challenges head-on, even when it seemed overwhelming. But Sarah wasn't always this calm and composed. Life had taught her these qualities the hard way. A few years ago, she had worked as a medic in the military. She had seen things that most people couldn't even imagine: people in pain, life hanging by a thread, and the strength it took to stay calm in chaos. Sarah had learned to think quickly, act smart, and never give up. These lessons had shaped her into the person she was today, someone who could handle both her own struggles and help others with theirs. As Sarah moved forward in the boarding line, she noticed the small details around her. A child tugged at their mother's sleeve, asking endless questions about the plane. An elderly couple laughed softly, sharing a quiet joke as they waited. Nearby, a young man frantically searched his bag for his passport. Sarah smiled at the little scenes of life happening all around her. It was these moments that reminded her how every person carried their own story. The line moved slowly, and Sarah felt the baby shift inside her. She rested a hand on her belly, feeling a mix of exhaustion and excitement. The thought of seeing her sister and being there for her gave her the strength to push forward. She could already picture her sister's smile when she walked through the door, and that thought made the discomfort of the journey worth it. Finally, it was Sarah's turn to hand her ticket to the flight attendant. She noticed how the flight attendant barely glanced at her before giving a sharp nod and waving her through. Sarah didn't think much of it at first, though the gesture felt a little cold. She walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, carefully making her way to her seat. The plane was already filling up, with people storing bags in overhead compartments and settling into their seats. The sound of chatter mixed with the occasional thud of bags being shoved into tight spaces. Sarah found her seat and sat down slowly, adjusting her seat belt to fit comfortably around her belly. She looked out the small oval window beside her, watching as the ground crew worked outside. For a moment, she let herself relax. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but she had made it this far. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, thinking of everything that had brought her here. As Sarah waited for the plane to take off, she couldn't help but wonder, why did life always seem to test her patience? It wasn't just the little things, like waiting in line or dealing with delays. It was the bigger challenges, the times when she felt like the odds were stacked against her, yet she found a way to keep going. She thought about all the people who might feel the same way, struggling quietly but refusing to give up. Have you ever been in a situation where your patience was tested to the limit? Maybe you were stuck in traffic when you needed to be somewhere important, or you faced a problem that felt too big to solve. What did you do? How did you find the strength to keep going? Sarah believed everyone had their own way of handling tough times, and she hoped her story might inspire someone else to face their challenges with courage. As the engines of the plane roared to life and the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Sarah took a deep breath. She didn't know what the journey ahead would bring, but she was ready to face it, just like she always had. Little did she know, this flight would be more than just a trip. It would become a test of her strength and character, one she would never forget. Sarah sat in her seat, gently rubbing her belly as she looked out the airplane window. She could feel the baby moving inside her, a little reminder of why she was taking this trip. She smiled softly, thinking about her sister and how happy she would be to see her. The hum of the airplane filled the cabin, and passengers continued to board, looking for their seats and placing their bags in the overhead compartments. Just as Sarah was beginning to relax, a flight attendant walked down the aisle. She was tall, with neatly tied hair and a perfect uniform. Her shoes clicked against the floor with each step, and she carried a clipboard in one hand. Her eyes scanned the rows of passengers with a look of quiet authority. She seemed polished and professional, but there was something in the way she glanced at Sarah, quick and uninterested, almost like Sarah wasn't important. When the flight attendant reached Sarah's row, she stopped. She looked at Sarah for a moment, then said in a cold voice, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you cannot sit here." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Oh, I think this is my seat," she said politely, showing her boarding pass. The flight attendant barely looked at it. She gave a small shake of her head and pointed to another row. "No, you'll have to move. We need the seat for someone else." Sarah felt a wave of confusion wash over her. She had chosen the seat carefully when booking her flight, making sure it was comfortable for her condition. "I booked the seat ahead of time," she said gently, trying to keep her voice calm. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand that, ma'am," she said, but her tone didn't sound understanding at all. It sounded firm and final, like there was no room for discussion. "You'll need to move." Sarah felt the eyes of other passengers turning toward her. She could hear quiet whispers and feel the tension growing around her. A couple seated nearby exchanged glances, and a man across the aisle frowned, clearly interested in what was happening. Despite the embarrassment rising in her chest, Sarah took a deep breath. She knew how to stay calm under pressure. Years of working as a medic in difficult situations had taught her to think clearly, even when things felt unfair. She wasn't going to argue just yet. Instead, she looked carefully at the flight attendant's face, noticing the way her eyes darted around nervously and how she kept glancing over her shoulder. Something wasn't right. "I really can't move," Sarah said softly but firmly. "I need the seat for my comfort. I'm 7 months pregnant." The flight attendant's expression didn't change. She tapped her clipboard impatiently and sighed. "I'm sorry, but it's policy. You can't sit here." Sarah's heart sank. She knew when someone was being dismissive. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about something more. Maybe it was the way she looked, maybe it was something else entirely. She had faced these moments before in lifetimes when people didn't take her seriously because she was quiet, because she didn't demand things loudly. But she had learned that staying calm and standing her ground was the best way to handle such situations. Before she could say another word, a woman sitting nearby spoke up. She was an older lady with kind eyes and a firm voice. "Excuse me, but I don't see why she has to move," the woman said. "She's clearly pregnant and needs to be comfortable." The flight attendant turned to the woman, looking annoyed. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern." "But it is," the older woman replied. She paid for this seat, didn't she? More passengers started whispering, and a young man a few rows back stood up. Yeah, that's not fair, he said. She has the right to sit where she booked. Sarah felt touched by their support, but she could see that the flight attendant wasn't going to back down easily. Instead of feeling angry, Sarah stayed calm. She observed the way the attendant was gripping the clipboard tightly, how her eyes seemed to scan the crowd as if looking for backup. Sarah realized that the woman wasn't just being strict, she seemed nervous about something. I understand policies, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. But I also know that I followed the rules when I booked my ticket. Is there something I'm not aware of? The flight attendant's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered. We have special seating needs for other passengers, she said stiffly. It's just how it is. Sarah wasn't convinced. She had seen too many situations where people tried to push others aside because they thought they could get away with it. She had dealt with soldiers in pain, families in distress, and tough emergencies. A seating issue on an airplane wasn't going to shake her. The tension in the cabin was thick now. Passengers were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendant's posture stiffened as she spoke into her radio, calling for another crew member. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready to stand up for herself. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stay calm even when you felt frustrated, she thought, looking around at the passengers. The whispers grew louder. A few people were pulling out their phones, perhaps recording the moment. Sarah knew that things could quickly get out of hand, but she also knew that standing her ground was the right thing to do. A man in a suit, who appeared to be another airline staff member, arrived. He had a friendly smile but a firm voice. What seems to be the problem here? He asked. The flight attendant quickly explained the situation, making it sound like Sarah was causing trouble. But Sarah remained calm and repeated her point. I'm not trying to make things difficult. I just need to sit in the seat I paid for. I'm pregnant, and this seat was the best choice for me. The man nodded and looked at Sarah thoughtfully. He glanced around at the watching passengers and then turned back to the flight attendant. Is there any serious reason she can't stay in her seat? The flight attendant hesitated. Well, we need the seat for someone else. But why? The older woman nearby asked again. She booked it first. The staff member sighed and checked the paperwork in his hands. Let's see what we can do, he said after a moment. Please stay seated, ma'am. Sarah felt a wave of relief. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew she had done the right thing by not giving up too easily. The flight attendant still looked unhappy, but she said nothing else and walked away. Sarah leaned back in her seat, feeling her baby move again. She smiled softly. Sometimes, standing up for yourself wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Sarah wondered what other people would do in her situation. Would they have spoken up, or would they have given in and moved seats? She knew everyone had their own way of handling things, but in this moment, she felt proud of herself for staying strong. The plane engines roared to life, and Sarah let out a deep breath. It was going to be a long flight, but she was ready for it. Sarah sat in her seat, feeling a little tired but still thinking about what had just happened. The flight attendant's rude behavior bothered her. It wasn't just about the seat. Something felt strange. Why was she being treated this way? Sarah looked around and noticed that other passengers were watching her with curious eyes. Some looked concerned, while others quickly turned away when she met their gaze. As the plane took off, Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her past, about the times when she had to stay strong in difficult situations. As a medic in the military, she had learned how to stay calm, even when things were tough. This is just another challenge, she told herself. Soon, she heard whispering from the row behind her. She opened her eyes and listened carefully. I heard they do this a lot, a woman whispered to her husband. Last month, a man was forced to move from his seat too. They said it was for a special passenger, but it didn't seem right. Sarah's eyes widened. Was this something that happened often? She needed to find out more. Quietly, she leaned back in her seat, pretending to read a magazine, but she was listening carefully to everything around her. A few minutes later, a man sitting next to her spoke softly. "Hey, I saw what happened earlier," he said. "That wasn't fair." He introduced himself as Tom, an off-duty journalist. "I've seen things like this before with airlines," he continued. "Sometimes they treat certain passengers differently, and it's not right." Sarah felt a little relief knowing she wasn't alone in thinking something was wrong. "I booked this seat weeks ago," she said. "Why would they ask me to move?" Tom nodded. "It could be something simple, like a mistake, but it could also be something bigger. Sometimes airlines have hidden rules they don't tell people about." Sarah thought for a moment. If something was really going on, she needed to know the truth. "Do you think we can find out more?" she asked. Tom smiled. "We can try," he said. "I've got some experience with this. Let's start by asking a few questions." Together, Sarah and Tom decided to talk to other passengers and listen for more clues. Sarah noticed an older woman sitting a few rows ahead who had spoken up earlier. She walked over carefully and smiled. "Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for me earlier," Sarah said. The woman smiled back. "Of course, dear. It wasn't right, what they did to you." Sarah hesitated before asking, "Have you ever seen something like this before?" The woman nodded slowly. "Yes, I have," she said. "Last year, my friend had a similar problem with this airline. They made her change seats without a good reason. She felt so embarrassed, just like you did." Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't just her. This was happening to other people too. Later, as Sarah returned to her seat, Tom showed her something interesting on his phone. "Look at this," he whispered. It was an online forum where people shared their travel experiences. "There are stories here about this airline moving people from their seats unfairly. Some even say it's because of how they look or where they come from." Sarah felt anger rise inside her. "This isn't fair," she said. "It's not just about me. Other people have been treated this way too." Tom nodded. "We need more proof," he said. "Let's see if we can catch anything suspicious during the flight." Sarah started to pay close attention to the flight attendant who had asked her to move. She noticed little things: how the flight attendant smiled and was friendly to some passengers but was cold and distant to others. She also overheard a conversation between two other crew members when they thought no one was listening. They mentioned something about keeping certain passengers in their place. Sarah's stomach turned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She whispered to Tom, "Did you hear that? Something isn't right here." Tom nodded. "We need to write all of this down. It could be important later." As the flight continued, Sarah began to doubt herself for a moment. "Maybe I should just forget about this," she thought. "Maybe I'm making too much of it." She stared out the window, feeling tired and unsure. Then, a memory flashed in her mind: her time working as a medic. She remembered a night when she helped a soldier who was badly injured. Everyone else thought there was no hope, but Sarah didn't give up. She stayed with him, working hard until he was stable. In the end, he survived because she didn't walk away. That memory gave her strength. She couldn't walk away from this either. Sarah looked at Tom and said firmly, "We need to do something." Tom smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." They decided to report what they found to the head flight attendant. Sarah walked up and calmly explained everything she had noticed: the unfair treatment, the overheard conversations, and the pattern of similar incidents. She spoke with confidence, knowing she was doing the right thing. The head flight attendant listened carefully and apologized, saying she would look into it. But Sarah wasn't sure if they would really take it seriously. Tom suggested they share their experience with others after the flight, maybe even report it to the airline's main office. As the plane started its descent, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. She hadn't stayed silent. She had stood up for herself and for others who had been treated unfairly. She knew the fight wasn't over, but it was a start. When they landed, Sarah and Tom exchanged numbers. "We'll keep in touch," Tom said. "I'll help you take this further if you want." Sarah smiled. "Thank you for helping me," she said. "This isn't just my fight anymore. It's for everyone who's been treated unfairly." Walking out of the plane, Sarah felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. She realized that standing up for what's right takes courage, but it's always worth it. And as she stepped into the airport, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let this go. Sarah sat in her seat, her heart pounding. She knew something was not right. The flight attendant had been unfair to her, and now, after talking to other passengers and gathering some information, Sarah was sure that this wasn't just about her seat. It was something bigger. She took a deep breath and whispered to Tom, the journalist sitting next to her, "I think it's time. We need to do something now." Tom nodded. "You're right. Let's do this carefully." Sarah stood up and walked slowly toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendant stood. Her hands felt a little shaky, but she reminded herself to stay calm. Passengers watched her curiously. Some of them knew what was happening, and they gave her encouraging looks. Sarah took a deep breath and said in a clear voice, "Excuse me, but I need to talk to you." The flight attendant, the same woman who had asked Sarah to move earlier, turned around with a frown. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said, her voice cold and sharp. Sarah didn't move. "No, I need to talk to you right now," she said firmly. Her voice was steady, and she knew she had to be strong. "I know what's going on." The flight attendant's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly crossed her arms. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice sounded nervous. Sarah took out her phone. "I've been listening," she said. "I heard you talking to another crew member about keeping certain passengers in their place. And I know I'm not the only person you've treated this way." A murmur spread through the cabin. Passengers were now paying full attention. The older woman who had spoken up before nodded in agreement. "That's right," she said loudly. "You've done this before, haven't you?" The flight attendant's face turned red. She glanced around, realizing that more people were watching now. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly. "Please, sit down." Sarah shook her head. "No. I won't sit down. I know I'm not the first person this has happened to. I talked to other passengers, and they've seen it too. You've been unfair, and we all deserve to know why." Tom stood up beside Sarah. "I've been looking into this," he said, holding up his phone. "There are complaints online about this airline treating certain people differently. And it seems like you have been involved in many of them." The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. She glanced toward the front of the plane, hoping another crew member would help her, but no one did. The other flight attendants stood quietly, watching the situation unfold. "Why do you keep asking people to move from their seats?" Sarah asked. "Why do you treat some people better than others?" The flight attendant hesitated. "It's airline policy," she said weakly. But Sarah didn't believe her. "No, it's not. I read the airline's policies. There's nothing that says a pregnant woman can't sit in the seat she paid for. So tell me the real reason." Passengers started whispering again. A man sitting a few rows back called out, "Yeah. Why did you do it?" The flight attendant's hands trembled. She looked around, clearly feeling trapped. Finally, she let out a sigh. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, we have special requests. Important people ask for certain seats, and we just make it happen." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "So you give better seats to people who pay extra or have special connections, and you push others aside?" The flight attendant didn't answer, but the look on her face said it all. Gasps filled the cabin. A mother holding her baby shook her head. "That's terrible," she said. "People should be treated fairly." Sarah felt a wave of relief. She had known something was wrong, and now the truth was out. "So you think it's okay to treat people differently just because of who they are?" she asked. "That's not fair, and it's not right." The flight attendant looked down, embarrassed. "I was just following orders," she mumbled. Tom turned to Sarah and whispered, "We need to report this when we land. The airline should know what's happening." Sarah nodded, feeling a new sense of strength. "I'm not going to let this happen to anyone else," she said. She turned to the other passengers and raised her voice. "If you've been treated unfairly on this airline, speak up. They can't keep doing this if we stand together." A few people clapped, and others nodded in agreement. The older woman stood up and said, "I will make a complaint too." Sarah smiled, feeling proud. She had doubted herself earlier, wondering if she should just stay quiet, but now she knew she had done the right thing. Standing up for herself wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had been treated unfairly. The head flight attendant soon arrived, looking serious. "I've heard what's going on," she said. "We will investigate this and take action." "I'm very sorry for your experience, ma'am." Sarah nodded, feeling hopeful. "I just want everyone to be treated with respect," she said. The rest of the flight continued quietly, but Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced the challenge, and she had won. Tom smiled at her. "You did great," he said. "You stood up for yourself and others. That's not easy." Sarah smiled back. "Thank you for helping me," she said. "Sometimes, we all need a little support." As the plane landed, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. She had come on this trip to see her sister, but she had also learned something important: standing up for what's right is always worth it. She knew she had made a difference, and that was what mattered. Have you ever faced a situation like Sarah's? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed quiet? What would you have done differently?